and welcome to the HWS News Hour 2020 election special. My name is Ricky P. Rice, and I'm coming to you today from what can only be described as a mullet. Judy Woodruff, the unbiased, the breaker of lies, the jarl of journalistic integrity, the mother of the multifaceted interview, and the keeper of the public trust has the night off. In our program this evening, we are diving in depth into the 2020 elections with analysts looking at local, congressional, and the presidential race across the country to make sense of what happened in this election cycle. So without further ado, let's hear the analysis of HWS's Paul 303 Campaigns and Elections class.
So the local campaign I looked at was New York State Senate District 59, and I looked at Jason Clement, who's the Democratic nominee for the seat. The district is located between Rochester and Buffalo, with parts of Monroe County being any kind of like urban center for it, and it had Livingston, Erie, and Wyoming County, which are very rural, very sparsely populated. There's kind of between the two urban centers of Rochester and Buffalo, it's really just rural and farmland. So Jason Clement ran on lowering taxes for those in the region and aiding small businesses. He's also a supporter of New York seeking to enact like a statewide single-payer healthcare system, which was one of his progressive bents. He was also pro-marijuana legalization, which stems from his previous job as an attorney for NORML, which is pro-marijuana legalization, lobbying and advocacy group. State Senate District 59 has been a Republican-held seat for the past decade, with the Democratic Party not even running an opposition candidate in the past few election cycles. So, of course, it was going to be a long shot for him going in. He had one PAC set up that was called Jason for Senate, and he raised virtually no money through it. And the county Democrats also didn't give him any financial backing because they knew he was going to be a long shot candidate. So why throw your money behind this someone? So he didn't really campaign at all. Outside of a few yard signs, he didn't run any ads. He didn't use any social media at all, and he didn't do any local speaking. I think the purpose of this campaign was just to provide an opposition candidate to Patrick Galpin, who's the Republican incumbent. And in the end, Patrick Galpin won 70% of the vote to Jason's 30%. And because of this lack of funding campaigning, the 30% he got was really just from people who were pissed off at Republicans and were casting their vote to oppose any Republican candidate down the ticket.
That's great. And so Nathan, what about your congressional race?
So my congressional race was for that U.S. House seat, New York 27. Nate McMurray was the Democratic nominee. He's the candidate I looked at. He ran a pretty traditional campaign, but he had hints of progressivism through it, pledging small business aid to those in the district. He was also pro single-payer healthcare, and he made a big campaign promise to move over to green energy in the region. The near State 27 basically falls in the same lines as the State Senate District 59, so urban regions of Rochester and Buffalo with rural in between. So there's a lot of diversity in the electorate that you need to campaign to. He was running against Chris Jacobs, who has been an elected incumbent for just the past couple months in a special election. And Chris Jacobs defeated Nate McMurray in that special election because he also ran in that. The reason for the special election was due to the imprisonment of Chris Collins, who formerly held the seat and was elected by a slim margin against Nate McMurray in 2018. At the time, he'd been indicted on insider trading charges, and he has subsequently been sentenced to a few years in prison. There was some hope going into the election that because of the instability of the seat and because of Nate McMurray's kind of slanted performance in 2018 versus the special election, that there would, and the hopes of a blue wave, that there would be a chance that Nate McMurray would win. However, because of, he had a devastating loss in the special election, the campaign would have to try out new techniques and campaigning strategies to try to pull off win. And unfortunately, in the last leg of the campaign, he was outraised and outspent by Chris Jacobs. And they even halted their mail advertisements, which are relatively cheap, as everyone knows. And by halting that, it kind of showed that the numbers weren't in his favor. So in the end, Chris Jacobs won with 63% of the total votes and Nate McMurray's 35% of the vote. This was really a shock to no one because of the fundraising disparities and the lack of good campaign from Nate McMurray, but it was a step up from his performance in the special election. Yeah.
So Nathan, this is a really interesting district because you get the suburbs of two Democratic cities, right, in a lot of rural areas. Do you think there's any potential in this district for it flipping or becoming a swing district, or do you see the demographics and the political positioning of this district be entrenched and a safe seat for the Republican Party for the foreseeable future?
So there has been some movement in the suburbs, with the growing suburbs outside of Rochester and Buffalo in general. Actually, people moving out of the city into the surrounding areas that are a solid Democratic base. The issue is that even with these more highly populated areas that are Democratic leaning, with the amount of space in between and the amount of people that make up Wyoming County, Livingston County, and then the rural parts of Monroe, Genesee County, there's really not much of a chance for it to flip. Obviously, with Nate McMurray's performance in 2018 against Chris Jacobs, granted he was indicted, but he only lost by about a point or so. So there is hope that you can see that these people aren't voting strictly down party lines when it comes to situations like that. Outside of indictments or any very bad coverage against the Republican candidate, though, I don't see Democrats really having a chance or really even putting forth a chance and actually spending money on the races because I don't think they think they'll win.
That's really interesting, right? And so one of the big debates, and I'd like you to carry through some of what you were just talking about with the presidential campaign for your last 2 minutes or so. And one of the things that's been a debate in the Democratic Party has been it was the Biden campaign less successful than it could have been because it taxed so far to the center, right? And so the Bernie side of the wing and the AOC side is saying, right, if they would have doubled down on sort of universal health care, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, et cetera, that they would have appealed to a wider base of voters. Do you think that dynamic, like if Nate McMurray would have ran further to the left, he would have been more successful in these spaces, rather than you mentioned single payer? So that's the real question, and then the question that's a lead into the presidential campaign is you've talked a lot about messaging, right? So what messages, and this is sort of what I'm getting at, what messages seem to be either flipping or convincing voters to change their partisan ideas, if there are?
So I guess that's two separate questions because Howie Hawkins is a Green Party candidate and ran the furthest left campaign, and he's who I look at for the presidential election. But he had a lot of downfalls considering he was a third party candidate. As for Nate McMurray and Democrat running to further left positions, I think it definitely helps. Obviously, polling, especially in New York, but also in some swing states, shows that progressive policies such as single payer healthcare, criminal justice reform are widely popular. And it's not just a far left versus everyone else divide that some people would lead you to think it would be. There's kind of been this shift away from liberalism in the past, really since 2008, since the financial crisis. And you've seen more Democrats running on these policies and winning. So when it comes to congressional districts and Nate McMurray and other Democrats running on these positions, I think that is something that can excite the base and get out the vote, especially for people who are moving into the suburbs who might not be excited about them before. And it can get out the vote and try and kind of slim down the margins.
So just one last question, and I'll let you off the hook. But because you studied Howie, and so that's a different sample, why did Howie do less well than Jill Stein? And is there anything else about Howie's race that you think we should all know about?
So in 2016, 6% of the Democratic base said they were going to vote for Howie Hawkins, and 3% Republican base said they intended to vote for Howie Hawkins. And nationally, that's a pretty big percent. And this time around, the majority of voters said voting down party lines was one of the most important things to them. So there really was this settling for Biden that people saw. And Howie Hawkins was not able to circumvent that and get out his messaging as well. He received about 1% less of the vote that Jill Stein did, which was about 0.3% to 1.2%. And this was really entirely due to like a settling campaign because we exist in the face of Trump and kind of an existential threat, as some might say.
can you tell us a little bit about your local race and what you saw as the most important factors that led to the victory or loss of the candidate?
Okay, so I guess for my local race, I followed the representative of District 2, Cedric Richmond. He was an incumbent Democrat, and a lot of people knew who he was. He was very well liked for past bills. Like he passed a $3 billion coastal relief fund, which would help restore the coast. And he also passed a lot of stuff for like maritime law. So a lot of stuff for the shipping industry, which a lot of people have jobs in New Orleans and towards the coast. Um, so he ran on again coastal restoration, storm and emergency relief, which I think which that really helped him because we had a record high of like 5 hurricanes this season, and New Orleans like didn't get hit, but they did have a lot of relief with electricity and stuff like that. And then he ran on again women's rights in the workplace. So basically, he would place laws to where like there wouldn't be any discrimination against women. And he lives in the heart of New Orleans, which is like pretty important for people in New Orleans. Like they want to know like where you're from. So he lives like right in the heart. So he did win, and New Orleans usually votes blue, and then they have in this district a little bit of Jefferson Parish, which was a little bit light pink. But I think since he does a lot for pretty much just New Orleans, that's why he got the vote.
Great. And how about your congressional race?
So I looked at Peter Winstrup for the Senate. He ran against Bill Cassidy, who's a Republican. Peter Winstrup was a former math teacher. He actually used to teach at my school and taught me math. He ended up leaving my school and taught in the inner city for a couple years. He mostly used social media to advertise, such as like Facebook, Instagram, and his own website. So I didn't see any ads on TV about him, nor did my family. But if you followed him on like Instagram and friended him on Facebook, you would see a lot of that. He ran on issues for Corona, which in New Orleans is pretty bad right now still. And so he was running on quarterly lockdowns and then special testing for essential workers. And he also ran on education, basically that every child would have guaranteed education from K through 12 because education's awful in Louisiana. And then he wanted to rebuild the economy, especially for commercial tourism and local businesses because during Corona, like everything shut down for a very long time. So all those jobs got really hit pretty hard. He's also really young and has 2 small kids. He only got 0.6% of the entire vote, and that was mostly from New Orleans because that's the only place people really knew him. And I found interesting that like other big cities like Baton Rouge, Lake Charles, Alexandria, Shreveport, and Monroe, they all voted bluish for the presidential race, but for the Senate, they all voted dark red.
So yeah, so again, that down ballot split from the presidential ticket to the congressional ticket is another factor here in Louisiana. How do you explain that? Was there anything from your two local campaigns in New Orleans and in Louisiana that explain that, or do you think?
Well, I think just the demographics, if you look at New Orleans compared to all the other big cities, New Orleans is a predominantly Black city. So I think that makes a lot of sense as to why it's always been more democratic. Also, like the big like colleges are in New Orleans. Like we have Tulane, Loyola, and University of New Orleans. And so I think that's why they vote more Democratic. Whereas in the northern parts of Louisiana, it's very rural. It's mostly white, and off like when I was doing my research, I found like they had very low education attainment. So I think that makes up why they voted more Republican.
And so it was dislike of Trump, not of the Republican Party in my neighborhood. We like our local Republicans, not our national
I
Republicans.
think so, that too. And I think Bill Cassidy is very liked as well because he's done a lot for schools in terms of like autistic and dyslexia. Like his wife is a doctor and they opened up special education centers for that. So I think he's liked in that aspect as well.
So we got a little. Tell us a little about your local race.
So I followed Adam Erickson. And Adam Erickson, he's a Hobart alum. He's a civics teacher in Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina. He was running for the 20th, North Carolina's 20th district against Ted Davis Jr. Ted Davis Jr. Something interesting about this race, Ted Davis Jr. is actually the former representative for District 19, but due to some redistricting, part of District 19 is now part of District 20. So Ted Davis was running against Erickson. Adam Erickson lost, receiving only 44.6% of the votes. Erickson ran this campaign as a local guy. He tried to reach out to people in the community, focus a lot on the pandemic. But unfortunately, the pandemic wasn't a big enough issue in New Hanover County. The pandemic the coronavirus only gained ground in late August, which is why why Erickson's campaign focusing on the pandemic didn't really help out so well. Ted Davis is also he was also part of the board of commissions in New Hanover County. So he is very well known in terms of the political scene, being well versed in the political scene in New Hanover County. So being an incumbent and having this political backing, he also was an attorney prior to his time as commissioner. So having this background sort of propelled him to win in this county.
That's great. And so you're in that race. He's better known. He's better connected, and that's sort of why he was able to beat Erickson.
Yeah.
And then just while we're on this one, did you go back to the data? Did this district go for Biden?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's fascinating. Yeah. Talk about that.
So this district voted for Biden, and this is the first time in the past 24 years that this county, New Hanover County, has selected a Democratic, as voted Democratic for the presidency. Previous years, they've fairly voted Republican. And I thought this was fairly interesting because Erickson, part of his campaign, he ran a very centrist campaign on North Carolina. This region of New Hanover County is a very wealthy county. A lot of people there are very educated. It's about 82% white, with a median income of like $52,000. So with that, people there, they're very educated Republicans. So just basing that with the way the media has portrayed Trump and the way Democrats have ran their campaign against Trump, the people of Hanover County sort of didn't view this election as like Democrats against Republicans. They viewed this as Democrats against Trump. So their thought was, if we can get Trump out, we like Davis Jr. and he's our Republican, so we can keep him as Republican.
That's great. It's really helpful, Michael. That confirms a lot of Olivia's research as well, what a lot of folks are finding. How about in your congressional races or your congressional races?
So similarly, I followed Mark Kelly in Arizona, and he, in a very similar note to Erickson, was running to flip his region. Mark Kelly ran against Martha McSally, who was she's actually the incumbent. So interesting about Martha McSally, she is actually a former veteran herself, a former Navy pilot. But Martha McSally ran 2 years ago for the other Senate seat and lost. And then when John McCain died, the Governor Ducey, appointed McSally to take over the seat, which is why there was a special election this year. So Mark Kelly ran. Mark Kelly is a former astronaut for husband of Gabby Giffords. And Gabby Giffords is very well known in Arizona. She was a congresswoman and she was shot in 2012 in Tucson, Arizona. So Mark Kelly ran this campaign on being like very fortunate enough to have his wife receive a lot of great health care for her time. He focused a lot on the pandemic. He focused not on running as a Republican or a Democrat, focused on running as a centrist. Mark Kelly also made it very clear that he wasn't for Biden or against Biden. He wasn't for Trump or against Trump. He just made his policies clear what he stood for, which was healthcare policy. He wanted help for veterans and whatnot. And in Arizona, Mark Kelly focused a lot in Maricopa County. And Maricopa County is a county that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, that Biden also focused his energy on as well. Maricopa County makes up about 52% of the Arizona population, with cities of Phoenix and Pima. So this was a really important place for both Kelly and Biden to focus in. In contrast to Erickson, Kelly ran his race a little bit different, in the sense that because the pandemic was so much of an issue in Arizona and not much of an issue in New Hanover, Kelly was able to actually harness the pandemic and use it as a spring spot for his campaign. And we saw that in the sense that with moderates in Arizona, exit polls showed to connect with Biden and Kelly, with 68% of moderates voting for Biden and 70% of moderates voting for Kelly, 68% of independents voting for Biden, and the 72% of independents voting for Kelly. So we sort of saw some connections between both. And so although Kelly, as much as he tried to distance himself from Biden, we saw trends in both races in Arizona.
So, Michael, you've got a really interesting set of cases because you've got two Democrats, both in swing states, right, with very different outcomes. So I'm wondering how much of that do you think helps explain the Biden-Trump thing, the Biden-Trump race? But then also the other thing that you just made me think of, right, with Mark Kelly, right? Do you think there was, do you think, was sort of the opposite of what I asked Nathan, right? Do you think if Biden would have gone further to the left, Mark Kelly would have, it would have been closer, or he would have lost a little bit? So if you could talk about a couple of those.
I think Mark Kelly's case in Arizona would have actually been a little bit stronger had he gone a little bit more to the left. And interestingly enough, while researching, I thought his campaign was doing the right thing about being very centrist because he's running for McCain's old seat. Everything Arizona has voted is went for Trump in 2016. Trump was trying to keep Arizona this year. So running in a centrist campaign, I thought, because the pandemic was so much of an issue, especially in Maricopa County, I figured that he'd focusing a lot more on the pandemic, focusing more on providing healthcare for all, more liberal ideas would have garnered more votes for him. And I think if Biden would have done the same, it probably would have been less of a closer race in Arizona.
Great.
So I researched Poppy Arford from the Maine 49th State House of Representative District. Interesting thing about that district, it's in Brunswick, so it's only in half of Brunswick, and Brunswick is well known because it's where Bowdoin College is, but District 49 is in the half that doesn't contain Bowdoin College, so it's an older, majority white, well-educated, kind of center-left Democratic district. They've been Democrat since 2012 when they had independent, but the independent was very vocal that they were a Democrat. They were just running as an independent. And so Poppy was the Democrat who represented this district. And she was very clear. She even quoted to me and said that the way you win the seat is you advertise yourself as a proud Democrat and a proud lifelong Democrat. And that's exactly what she did. She's been a resident there for over 2 decades, and so she has a pretty good network there. So she was able to like build a network of like other people who are pretty established in the community, and then reach out to people she hadn't known yet. And she really made a good job on social media and a really strong effort of like canvassing through like a biking canvassing and like a running video campaign, and was really successful. She won by about 200 votes against the Green independent candidate, Fred Horch, who was kind of muddying the waters and kind of tried to make it clear that he was a Democrat, even though he wasn't running as that. It was kind of funky, but yeah. So like the opposite of proud Democrat would be, I don't know, what jumps to mind is like, what jumps to mind is like an AOC or someone like that who runs as a Democrat but is very outspoken against the Democratic Party or like the Democratic establishment. Whereas Poppy, on the other hand, was very like I've voted Democrat my whole life. I've supported all of these candidates. I'm proud to vote Democrat every single election. And she also she did a really good job at advertising endorsements she got from like stereotypical or traditional Democratic institutions like Planned Parenthood and a couple of local like green organizations in Maine. And so that was what she meant as a proud Democrat, that she just like voted her whole life and that she's not very critical of the Democratic establishment. Like Naomi, I researched Sarah Gideon in the Sarah Gideon-Susan Collins race. What stuck out to me about that race is Sarah Gideon, from my perspective, her campaign was very reflective of Joe Biden's campaign and the fact that they were running as, again, proud Democrats, running as kind of center-left candidates that are morally and ideologically opposite from Trump and the Republican Party. Sarah Gideon had kind of a layup. She was running against Susan Collins, who was by far the least, or not by far, but voted the least popular senator in the entire country, even below Mitch McConnell. In the build-up to this race, I think it was in June that poll came out, and so she kind of used that in her campaign strategy, and that was kind of the center of her campaign strategy, that she was running as not Susan Collins. She obviously ran on some policies. She ran on a kind of pragmatic healthcare policy, very green oriented, but the center of her race was that she was a better alternative than Susan Collins. And I think that what stemmed out of that strategy was she wanted to increase turnout because I don't know, the kind of like canonical assumption about politics, especially big races like this, is that higher turnouts aid Democrats, which I think she was kind of running on. And it worked, kind of. She flipped Portland blue, where Portland, Maine, which is the biggest city in Maine, actually voted red for Susan Collins in 2014. Same with Augusta, the capital. But it didn't work enough because she got like almost double what the Democrat who ran against Susan Collins in 2014 got, but she still lost by like 70,000 votes to Susan Collins. And so my biggest criticism of that is that if she really wanted to win that race, she had to get disaffected Susan Collins voters who added to that vote that she was the least popular senator in the entire country, and appeal to them instead of appealing just as like an alternative, not like running as an individual. So if she ran on a more policy oriented campaign, she would have been more successful in that regard. I think if she moved a little bit to the left and made it more policy oriented, I think it definitely would have helped her. I think she could have easily made an appeal to the white rural working class in Maine that she didn't really make it a strong enough appeal to, because she won the urban centers, she won Portland, she won Augusta, and she won those suburban areas too, but she didn't win enough of the rural counties to like take enough of the votes from Susan Collins into her camp. So I think if she moved to the left, or even if she made a stronger policy argument, I think she would have been more successful. I mean, same with Biden. I think he could have flipped Florida. He maybe could have flipped Texas if he made a policy-oriented argument about for those two states, for why people should vote for them in those two states.
Okay, so the local race that I was looking into is a mayoral election in Pasadena, California. It's a city that has around 140,000 people, and the candidate I chose is Mayor Terry Tornick. He was the current incumbent until his opponent, Victor Gordo, won. That was something that was really surprising. I wasn't expecting him to lose. My assumption was that since he was mayor since 2015, that it was going to keep on going. But his opponent, Victor Gordo, who held 54.37% of the vote, compared to Tornick, who won 45.63%. Some of the reasons why this election was super interesting to me was because his opponent, Victor Gordo, was born in Mexico. He immigrated to the States at the age of 5, and he's the city's second longest serving councilman since 2000. He represents District 5, which is one of the city's most ethnically diverse districts. The reasons why Terry Tornick, there's a bunch of reasons why he probably lost, is because he didn't appeal to the right interest group. The city has a demographic of 55% white, 33.5% Latino, and he was appealing to more of the Armenian American community by going to the nonprofit organizations and visiting their sister cities. On the other hand, because of the rising Latino population, Gordo definitely appealed to them more and was involved in the community. A critique that Gordo presented about Torvik was the fact that outside developers are gaining the upper hand over like everyday families. So he appealed to the middle class family, lower income, and like immigrant-based families by talking about how overdevelopment is a really big issue in California in general. Another factor that got involved was the fact that he raised more money and spent twice as much money than Mayor Tornick did. He raised $668,000 compared to Tornick, who raised $308,000. Tornick was heavily funded by wealthy individuals and corporate executives instead of like labor union PACs that Gordo was more funded by.
And so on the local race,
Yeah.
You've done a really good job looking at the demographics, the money, the messaging, and the interest group. Is there anything else was there any reason why the mayor did so poorly? Like why he wasn't able to pull out that race?
I think it also has to do with the fact that he responded really poorly to the pandemic. He was traveling a lot in the first week and he didn't have a response about it until 2 weeks later. Gordo, on the other hand, was already doing affordable housing and reaching out to the communities that were affected, which were mostly POC communities.
That's great. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
How about your congressional race?
My congressional race was based on AOC. She ran for re-election to represent New York's 4th congressional district, which represent Queens and Northern Bronx. She won by 68.7% in comparison to John Cummings, who was the only Republican candidate. He was also a former police officer, and I think it was very obvious that AOC was going to win. It has to do, it's also another important factor is the fact that she made $17 million in campaign contributions, and it's all grassroots organizations. Her opponent, Cummings, raised $10 million. It was the most expensive house race in the nation.
So how do you explain that? Why is a safe seat, right? That 70%, there's no chance of Republicans taking that without a really peculiar or particular situation, right? So why is this non-competitive race the most expensive and the ones that people put the most money into for the House?
I think it has to do with what she stands for and her ideologies and the fact that she isn't really influenced by corporations. That's her big emphasis on the fact that she really represents the people, and they see how that's really shown through her grassroots organization like style of campaigning and how she's so hands-on with people. She did a really good job of organizing and generating like a turnout spike. Yeah, and it's like something that she did recently was like have events even with the pandemic going on, like online events and like handing out groceries to local places that she's been to.
So what elements from Pasadena and Queens and the Bronx did you see come up in the presidential election or vice versa?
I think it was how they were targeting the POC communities and how that was really important. I can think about how the 14th district in New York is mostly 70% people of color, and how that's something that I've noticed in like the national elections, how Trump was able to win the Latino population in Florida, versus the California voters who are in the Latino population who are more unified to go towards Biden. Yeah. So just like catering towards different groups and how AOC is really critical of the Democratic Party, and seeing that socialism is something that's a good turnoff for most moderate voters. She advocates for the fact that since Black Lives Matter is something that was also a controversial topic, just how it changes with time, and that's something that really won't be as divisive.
All right, so I focused on the town council race in my hometown of Mammoth Lakes, California. There are a little over 4,000 people who voted in our town, and the candidate I was following is a newcomer. Her name's Sarah Ray. She's been local in our town for just over a decade. She's worked in the service industry in our town and the tourist industry. And she was running against 3 other people, one incumbent who was running for re-election, and then 2 other people. It was really widely expected that the incumbent was going to come in first place, but Sarah actually exceeded expectations and came in first. She got 1,594 votes, and then the second place candidate got around 1,200 votes, and then the other 2 did significantly less than that. She really focused on kind of the grassroots campaign in our town. She was the only candidate to have any online presence. She had a website, which none of the other candidates had. She did some door-to-door campaigning, which none of the other candidates really did because of the pandemic, but she felt comfortable enough in our town to be allowed to do that. She was endorsed by our town's local Democratic Party, which I think was a really big help to boost her presence and recognition in our town, because they're really the only political group in our town. Yeah, that's kind of happened in the local race.
That's great. And it was a bit of a surprise, right?
Yeah, it was. You think the incumbents could be really strong. He's a relatively popular guy in our town. He's not really hated very much. He's one of the only members on our town council who has been sometimes vocally against the multi-use facility, which is a multi-use recreational facility that our town's been trying to build for the last decade and a half. That's a lot of tension in our town. Sarah Ray was against that, which I think also help her improve her performance over what people expected. She also focused a lot on affordable housing and housing as a human right, because we have a really large working class workforce in our town that is in this relatively small, densely populated area that isn't very well kept and not very good housing, really old area. So she focused on improving low-income housing for our town.
Great. How about your congressional race?
So I followed my congressional district, which is the 8th district in California. He was following the Democratic candidate. Her name is Chris Bubser. She lost by around 12 points. It was 44 to 46 for the Republican. She made gains over the last Dem candidate that ran in this district, but she was not able to do enough to win. There was quite a lot of vote splitting in this district. The district went for Biden by about 11 points, and then went for the Republican for about the same amount. So it seems there are about 5 or 6% of the people who voted for Biden that then went and voted for Trump. And I think that's kind of indicative of a lot of what happened around the country, that people were convinced that Donald Trump is not a good president and he isn't fit for the job, but they were not convinced that the Republican House members were tied to him. And so they were able to make a decision that I'm going to vote Trump out of office, but I still like these Republican congressional officials and keep them in office. She focused a lot on Trump and not really on as much policy as one would have liked. She didn't have a very good in-person campaigning, like door-to-door knocking and actually physical presence, which I think a lot of Democratic candidates pushed off this cycle because of the pandemic, and a lot Republicans were a lot more comfortable being out there and canvassing and stuff, which I think helped them improve in some areas. But the main thing I kind of saw looking through nationally was the turnout was the really big thing that pushed Biden over, and it was this slight shift to the left in turnout in suburbs around cities like Milwaukee and Atlanta and Phoenix that really pushed Biden over. He won by 200,000 votes in 4 or 5 cities across the country, really pushed him over. And it was Biden's focus on his message of Trump is a uniquely bad candidate. He's a uniquely bad person that's unfit for office. And that message of Trump's persona is, I think, really what caused Biden to not have as good a performance as expected.
This is interesting stuff here, Karen. So on the one hand, you talked about turnout being a thing, but then you also sort of intimated, and it's come up in a few of our other reporters today, that there's an issue between, are we running just against Trump or are we putting policies and ideas ahead?
Exactly.
So the first question is, how do you talk about policy in an election that includes Trump?
I think you talked about policy on how he has implemented policy and how those policies have substantively affected people's lives rather than speaking to Trump as some boogeyman character. I also think a lot of people agree more with left-leaning policies, but I think the label of Democrat has become really toxic. And if you are not able to overcome that kind of just static level of unlike of the Democratic Party, you're not going to be as successful as you could be. And I think candidates who have focused more on policy, so every candidate in a swing district who ran on Medicare for All won their reelection. All the House Democrats who lost their seat were relatively centrist blue dog Democrats who were opposed to Medicare for All, were opposed to Green New Deal. And looking at those candidates and what kind of attack ads their Republican opponents were running on, it was a lot of Nancy Pelosi. It was a lot of Dems are lying, Dems are crooked. And it was not a focus really on these left policies. It was a focus on who the Dems are as a group. They're these like the lion Dems.
And so do you think for the next presidential race, do you think this was just an anomaly? Do you think the suburbs in these areas that put Biden over, according to your analysis, will be sustainable? Or is this simply just the factor of 2020, the pandemic, Trump, et cetera, and then in 2024, we'll return to the old suburbs, rural versus city?
I think a lot of that depends on who the Republican candidate is in 2024. I think if they have Donald Trump ends up running again, which has been floated that he could run again in 2024, I think it'll be hard, but I think the suburbs are winnable for Democrats. Again, I think these policies are very popular with people, but I think the label of Democrat is really harmful. So if they can get beyond that, but yeah.
That's great. Race, so what you discovered?
So for both my local and congressional races, I decided to cover the same geographic district. So both at the state senate level and the New York State congressional House of Representatives. So just the background around the district, it's actually a pivot district. So I voted for Obama for 2 terms and Trump for 1. And again, Trump for this term. It's majority white, around 75% of it. Its Latino population is growing. It's around 17%. It only has 5% of African American community and 3 of like Asian American and other. It's highly educated. It's around 91% have graduated high school and 30% have a bachelor's degree or higher. And it's increasingly an older voting demographic because of housing, which is 51% of the houses are valued over New York State's average of $338,000.
How did you find that data?
The census.
Interesting. And so based on these demographics, how would you label this? It's a pivot county, but do you think it's safer Republican or Democratic based on the
So because of the like changes in prices of housing and stuff like that, and because of the increase in older voters that are obviously wealthy, it was solidly Democrat like 10 or 12 years ago. It had a Democratic House of Representative that had served for 12 years before the current candidate ousted him. So on the local level, my state senator, he won with 54.8% of the vote, and he really won because he distanced himself from the national party. He was a former district attorney in the district, and he was the sitting assemblyman for District 2, which is encompassed within the actual Senate district. He ran on hyperlocal issues like bail reform. He ran on environmental issues such as beach erosion, and he was supported by a beloved state senator who was retiring, so his seat was vacant. And that senator had served for 44 years before retiring this term. And he basically won with running the idea of that bail reform in New York is causing an increase in crime. So we've had some massive cases that bail reform has come out looking really bad. So Meryl Streep's nephew this summer got into a road rage incident and almost killed an 18-year-old kid. The kid had to be flown to Stony Brook. They cut his head open and had to do immediate surgery, and he was let out with $5,000 in bail. And then another one, there was a DUI and vehicular homicide, and the lady was on alcohol and cocaine. And the charges from the DA hadn't brought like the homicide case yet, but she was released with $1,000 in bail the next month. So he really ran and pushed on these issues. Like, this is what bill reform is doing, like our community.
So that's really informative. We learned so much about the district, and then also we get an idea of how these very sort of kitsch issues bill reform. Did you also see this play out at the congressional level?
No, actually, my congressional representative is Lee Zeldin, who went all in on Make America Great Again and Trump. He won with 61% of the vote. And so you could see him around town wearing the MAGA hat. He held 3 or 4 fundraisers for Trump in Long Island. He's done multiple Fox News appearances on behalf of Trump. He's gone to the White House and sat with Trump 2 or 3 times. He spoke at the RNC. He campaigned with Trump at Tulsa. He was named to Trump's defense team for impeachment. And he's copied Trump's language against his opponent, calling her, who's a chemist professor at Stony Brook, calling her dangerous, a radical professor who refused to condemn rioters and looters. So he's.
How do you explain this, Jamie? How are these 2 candidates so different and winning in this?
So I think that this actually hurt him, and he would have lost had it not been for his relationship with Trump. Because of COVID-19, this district was hit really hard. We've had 54,000 cases and around 2,000 deaths. And because he had you're the president, when the pandemic really started to take off, Trump basically took from the federal stockpile and gave to New York District 1 first before the rest of the entire New York State. So Zeldin being at the ear of Trump received all of this PPE and masks that helped him win the district, because the older voters and older population really kind of like screwed him because they're most at risk. But because he did this and he pressed on this hard, he was like, I did this. All of his ads are about COVID-19 and how he brought all this in. And then towards the end, as Trump started to people started to realize this is a really big issue, that he started to kind of push himself away, but not really. Still saying that, Trump helped the district, I helped the district because of my relationship with Trump. This is why we got what we had and why we're not in a worse situation. But he also started talking about how he's a bipartisan member of Congress, and he's also stressing we need more COVID relief. So that one issue is, I think, would save this.
It's fascinating, and the idea, it makes so much sense. But if you're going to run in this cycle as someone close to Trump, you have to explain the benefits of that, right? That I'm not running into Trump because I support all his policies, but because I can get him to do things for our district. Super powerful, really interesting. What are are there any other things that you noticed percolating into these 2 races from the Trump and Biden campaign, or any other ways that they connected to what was happening at the national level?
I think it kind of just shows 2 sides of the same coin, how some voters are really into the person and who Trump is, and then other persons are really just focused on the policies that are being proposed at the national level. Anthony Palubo, he won because of the local issues and the local, really hyper local things and policies that people cared about, while Zeldin was running on kind of an idea, in the Trump campaign, and then later on was yeah, but he did this for us.
Sure. So I focused on Nader Sayegh in New York Assembly's 90th district, which is Yonkers, New York. So it's Lower Westchester. It's probably one of the more diverse cities in Westchester. Its population is roughly 200,000, so it's the 4th largest city in New York. His campaign, for lack of a better phrase, wasn't that deep. He ran unopposed. In 2018, he beat Joe Pinion by a lot. I think at the margin, he won 65% of the vote, and Joe Pinion won roughly 30. So he was on the Board of Education, and my mom actually knows him because she's a teacher in Yonkers. So she has a lot of high things to say about him. He's a really nice guy. Looking at his finances, he got a lot of donations from unions and a lot from the education sector as well. So that kind of helps explain his policies. Recently, he supported a bill for more COVID relief and getting more testing available for minority communities in Yonkers, because the pandemic has affected minority communities disproportionately.
So Maddie, what do you think is the point of a campaign, politically, when you're running unopposed? Why did he go through these motions? Why did he raise some money? Why do you think you'd do that if you were unopposed?
I guess it kind of helps explain where his support and where his focuses are like and energy is focused on. But again, I really wasn't able to find a lot because he was unopposed,
Right.
so that was kind of a difficult part of my research.
Oh, absolutely. How about at the congressional level? Who did you follow?
I followed Jamal Bowman, and he's New York's 16th congressional district, which is also makes up Lower Westchester and parts of the Bronx. So his campaign was really funky because his opposition was Patrick McManus, but there was nothing on Patrick McManus. I couldn't find it, like one thing about this man until after the election. There was finally a picture released of him. Like I even looked on Google Images and couldn't find anything, so that was really shady. But Jamal Bowman's I guess election race would have been his primary versus Elliot Engel, who's been in Congress since 1989. And I really think the pandemic had a big effect on Bowman winning 55% of the vote to Elliot Engel's 40.6. Elliot Engel spent between March until roughly September in Maryland, so he was within his own congressional district, which New Rochelle was the outbreak of COVID in New York, basically, and that is one of the largest cities in his congressional district. So it was pretty sus that he wasn't even in the state. So
Pretty sus indeed. And it matches kind of what Mario was talking about Pasadena, right? That if you're not doing the job during a crisis, you might get blamed for that. And so one of the other things I want to ask you before we get into the presidential race. Also, like Mario's research, AOC and Jamal Bowman both were 18. AOC did the same thing that Bowman did this year, unseated a long-term Democratic establishment party person, right, and shaking it up a little bit. So do you think that this is just going to lead, do you think this is a sign of just growing polarization between urban and rural areas? Or do you think it's just specific to what was happening in this race this particular time?
I mean, I think it definitely signifies a more progressive identity in lower New York. It kind of like Bowman winning almost solidified AOC's win and made sense of it, if that makes sense, because a lot of people were really like, oh, she'll only win one term, and then she won again, and then Bowman also won, so two progressive like congressional members from lower New York. So.
And so then what's your take based on these two races with one of the questions that's been asked a lot all over? What now that the Democrats have won the presidential election ostensibly, we'll see how it goes the next 2 weeks. But what does that tell us about the figures in the Democratic Party? And for the local race as well, let me simplify this. What do your races tell you about the conflicts in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if at all any?
I think mine do signify a more progressive leaning, like Democratic Party and towards like a leftist ideology. But it's also difficult to say because New York has always been a blue state, and lower New York has always been more liberal than, I guess, like upper New York and upstate. So that's like a huge part of it. I don't know if that's like a good answer.
No, it's great. And I think getting at the geography and the specificity means that maybe something's happening in New York that isn't extrapolating everywhere. Maybe it's happening in New York and Seattle, but not happening in Portland, Maine, and not happening in big cities everywhere, right? And so, again, I think the question the Democratic Party may have to ask is, are these folks for the Bowmans, the AOCs, the vanguards, or are they going to be siloed off into the back? What do they call it in the UK part? The backbenchers, right? Okay. And so then in terms of that, are there other things that you noted in the presidential race that filtered down through either of these two races?
I mean, I did my paper about how COVID was basically the forefront of why any candidate won, and politicizing the pandemic was a key part to any race, and being it benefited candidates who were more positive on getting stimulus, more COVID relief, and then Donald Trump basically denying the pandemic and telling people not to wear masks, like helps explain why he lost.
Yeah, so this semester, the local race that I followed was a Republican candidate, Kimberly Klacik. She was running for Congress in the 7th District of Maryland. She, as I said, is a Republican, but she's also an African-American woman, and this is a very urban area. And previously, she just lost in a special election a year ago in replacing Elijah Cummings' seat. And this is a very Democratic district. It's been a stronghold, so her running again this year was definitely a long shot. But what really brought her to like the mainstream was her campaign advertisement she released. She claimed that Black lives don't matter to Democrats, and she really went along that lines of bashing Democrat cities and not really mentioning her candidate, Kwasi Mfume. And this advertisement ended up bringing her into the national spotlight. And while she only had $300,000 raised before the advertisement, she was able to end up raising $7 million. And when looking through those campaign receipts and where that money was coming from, it wasn't really coming from the district at all. It was primarily coming from out of state. And these donors were really allowing her race to resonate with the national message that Donald Trump was pushing rather than the solutions that her district needed. And in doing so, she ended up losing the race, and she really only gained 3%. She did 3% better than when she had previously ran, and that was something I was really interested in seeing, is how that money was going to affect her campaign race, because she raised so much and was so unanticipated. So I followed Kevin O'Connor. He ran as a Republican in Massachusetts for Senate. And this one was less interesting than the Klasick one, in that Massachusetts is a very Democratic state, and it was really a long shot for Kevin O'Connor to run against Ed Markey in particular, being that he's an incumbent and he's just a really well-known national figure. But something that I thought was interesting was that I think there's a lot more moderate Democrats in Massachusetts, and there are Republicans in Massachusetts, but they're really unaware of Kevin O'Connor's platform because he didn't have the money raised to spread that awareness. And when looking at his platform, like comparatively, he's much less of like a hard Republican than many would think. He has much more moderate solutions. He's really concerned with how Washington, D.C. was structured in general, and imposing like term limits and really just fixing Washington, D.C. And I think that's a really attractive issues that didn't really come up in the national spotlight. And because of that, people weren't really aware of Kevin O'Connor's stances on those things. And people were more attracted to Ed Markey's opinions on like climate change, being that he's backed like things like the Green New Deal, which are really important to a lot of people in Massachusetts, being that it's so environmentally progressive. And he ended up losing in a 2-1 margin. But all in all, he didn't really stand much of a chance, in the sense that he didn't raise enough money, and also COVID restrictions made it really difficult for him to campaign. So definitely less on Kevin O'Connor's campaign and more on Klasick's campaign, in that she was really resonating with the message of Donald Trump. And something that I thought that, and what I wrote about in my election notebook analysis, was that the idea of bashing Democrat cities that Donald Trump did so much during the campaign, it really, I don't think, in the moment, I thought we were considering whether or not it would be effective and it would frighten suburban voters. And I think it wasn't effective, and it actually it can be counteracted by looking at the urban vote and how that influx of voters from urban areas, by looking at states like Georgia and Pennsylvania. The outcome really didn't reflect the message that Klasick and Trump are trying to say, and saying that these cities are madness and the Democrats are radical and pushing these radical laws. And if you look at how urban areas reacted to that narrative, they actually responded heavily in favor of Biden. And it shows that the message that Donald Trump was trying to push wasn't really very effective at all.
Sure thing. So for my local candidate, I chose John Flynn. He regained his power as the district attorney in the 41st district. Flynn belongs to the Democratic Party, and he ran this past election cycle unopposed. The 41st district is representative of the Buffalo, New York region and Erie County more broadly. This district includes the city of Buffalo and the surrounding suburbs. This area is roughly 82% white, 13% black, and 3% Latino. This area leans blue in general, though Flynn was fully endorsed by both parties. The re-election was seemingly easy. However, there were controversies over Flynn's job. Well, I mean, as we've talked about in class, there's more white people who lean Republican and black people lean Democrat. But the biggest thing with John Flynn was there was the controversy. A Buffalo cop shot and killed a young black man during the Black Lives Matter movement era, and there was a lot of rioting in Buffalo. a lot of people ran around holding signs saying resign John Flynn, all this stuff. Nothing ever came about over that, but that was the biggest thing because he ran unopposed, there really wasn't like a race to follow.
Yeah.
However, like following that that pushback from the people was interesting.
Definitely. Do you think do you know that he win his last election? Has he run opposed?
He did. Yeah, he did.
Did he lose
He
any
ran,
votes?
yeah, he ran. Sorry, yeah, he won his last election, so he was the incumbent in the position, and he ran unopposed. He had full endorsement from both parties. Yeah, I follow Chris Jacobs. He ran against Nate McMurray for the 27th congressional district. This region's right outside Buffalo and Rochester. It's the suburbs in between, pretty much. Similarly, it's a pretty wealthy area. The average income is $65,000 a year. Let's see. The biggest thing I saw for this was I read an article right before the race, and it said that Chris Jacobs was supposed to win, but within a 5-point margin. I believe he won by a 27-point margin. So similar to polling errors all across the country. This was a big polling error that
Definitely.
so I think Jacobs did a really good job of putting his name out there. He was the incumbent in the position, and like when I'm home, I saw a bunch of Jacobs yard signs and commercials on TV. I really didn't see anything about McMurray, so he just did a better job. Obviously, like I said, like the polling issues were a huge factor. There were polling issues that I actually talked about in one of my reviews for the presidential election. From what I saw, a few polling sites projected Biden to win Nebraska, Florida, and Iowa, which I mean didn't happen. And also, like the numbers were much closer in states that Biden did win. Overall, also the Black Lives Matter movement I think played a really large role overall, and even like the state level and the national level. I just talked about the institutional organizations and how they helped, I think, Biden propel to victory.